Hi there, and welcome to the Educator's Corner podcast, the show that brings you conversations with educators from all over the world. Conversations where we stay curious for a little bit longer about the issues, challenges, and opportunities which we are facing in our schools and in our communities. Today, we're going to continue the conversation we started in the last podcast about going remote. And is going remote the solution to the teacher recruitment crisis? That was the question that Mark, Steed and I were asking in the last podcast. So welcome back to the Educator's Corner podcast. Mark, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well, and it's great to be here, and I think it's the fourth one of these we've done, so that's great. But obviously, since we last were together on the podcast, we've actually run a session live at the COBIS Conference in London, talking about hybrid teaching and remote learning, and that was a really well attended session, and we had some great contributions from the floor and a great floor discussion. So I'm interested, a couple of weeks on from that, Kai, what are your reflections and what did you take away from all that?
Well, it certainly was a packed session at the COBIS Conference, and I think we've started quite a number of conversations with colleagues from the UK and also right across the world. And I think we've got some really exciting plans about how we want to continue those conversations, but we'll come back to those towards the end of the podcast. So what are my reflections? I think one key point that I've been mulling over the last couple of weeks is really when we've had a lot of feedback at that event, and we've had a lot of feedback online as well. And quite a few colleagues from around the world are still challenging why we're looking at remote teaching and why aren't we trying to get more, face-to-face teachers back into the education system. And so I guess I'd like to reiterate, if we take it at a school level, down in British School Salalah, the reason that we went for a partly online solution was because there was no Key Stage 4 solution for those students. It was a very small number. But with face-to-face teaching, we could not afford to provide an offer at Key Stage 4. And so by going a third online, a third face-to-face, a third independent study, that enabled us to provide a Key Stage 4 opportunity where previously none existed. So it wasn't a case of, shall we do online or face-to-face? It's either those students have something which has an online element, or they have nothing. So it might not be perfect, but, I think we know Voltaire's, it's attributed to Voltaire, I think, the statement, you don't let perfect be enemy of the good. And then I think it's similar with the A-level psychology here in British School Muscat, which we're offering for the first time from August. If we stay with a face-to-face modality as a solution to providing A-level psychology, we simply cannot afford to employ a full-time or even get a part-time face-to-face teacher and provide a number of post-16 students with the opportunity to study psychology. By switching to an online modality, we are then, like in Salalah, providing educational opportunity for students. And if we didn't go into that modality, that opportunity wouldn't exist. And again, it might not be perfect, but it's better than nothing. So that's really my reflection on a school level. And then I think, when we're thinking of this like across, the UK education system or the global education system, we've had feedback, and I do understand where this is coming from, where colleagues are saying, well, why don't we pay teachers more? Why don't we look at the issues which are driving teachers out of the profession? Isn't that the problem we should be trying to solve? Well, it might be, and there's probably some mileage in that, but also as school leaders, we've got to think about the things we can control, the things we can do. And just on things like teachers' pay, there are international schools like mine who are in a very favourable position where we do offer very competitive tax-free salaries, annual flights, high quality private medical care. It's a really competitive package. My staff don't teach classes bigger than 24 students, very engaged students. We teach 180 days a year, not 190 days in the UK. The accountability system hasn't got the reputation in the international sector that Ofsted has in the UK. It's much more developmental and supportive. So, all the factors which I'm sure are driving colleagues out of the education system in the UK, it's hard to see those factors being an issue in some international schools. But even in those conditions, competitive salaries, engaged children, small classes, and so on, we are still struggling to recruit specialist teachers at secondary level. So I'm afraid unfortunately, it's not as simple as just we need to pay teachers more, or they need to have, more. We offer our teachers 20% PPA, really favourable conditions, and still we struggle. So, I think we do need to look at alternative solutions. Mark, over to you.
Absolutely, I totally agree, and I do think we need to explore some of this stuff, and it isn't just the fact that the maintained sector in the UK is in such difficult situations, and indeed the independent school is going through quite a difficult time at the moment as well. But looking at my reflections, I think the thing that really struck me was the debate we had around pedagogy. And I think that we opened up a really interesting discussion about what does good remote teaching look like. And I think the trouble with this debate is that it's got the shadow of, how we did it in COVID, which, we did it in COVID at the last minute without any training. We were learning it on the hoof. There was good practice. There was some bad practice. There was a lot of very difficult times during that period. For other reasons, a lot of stress around for all sorts of obvious reasons. So I think now, post-COVID, we can come at this debate, differently. And I think we can start looking at asking questions like, how does remote teaching differ from remote tutoring? I mean, online tutoring's got a real traction around the world. But it's quite clear that managing a group of, say, 9 to 12 students online teaching is very different from managing 1 or 2. And I think we've got to really, as a educational community, work together to sort of bottle what works. How do we engage students online when teaching them? What are the optimum sizes? I think, we're having a very interesting discussion whether the class size should be sort of 8 or 11, because you can get 9 or 12 people on a screen pretty easily. You can, if you think about meetings that you're in, any meeting above 12 in a meeting, and you can't engage with people in the same way. You can't see them in gallery view quite so well. So I think these sorts of factors, these practical suggestions are there. And I think that will be an interesting debate. And I think I'm really interested in this PGCE and remote teaching that the University of Derby are looking at. And it'd be great to see how they do it. So as I say, we're going to keep this conversation going. And I think we need practitioners on the ground to say, well, look, this is really good. This worked well. I find this sort of lesson or, using this technique works, but using this one doesn't. I think that's where we've got to head. But that's I think the structure of so that was my most important reflection. I think that I was really pleased that we'd opened up that debate.
I've talked a bit about the problems at a school level and also an international level in terms of teacher recruitment. You've talked about the issue around the pedagogy. I think another big dimension to why we're talking about this and why we're not only thinking about this, why things are happening in this online space, is that we've also got a real problem, definitely in the UK and in other parts of the world, with student engagement and student attendance. And I did a little calculation earlier today. And I think if you add up the number of students who are home educated, who are persistently absent, who are what's called missing education, if you add those three groups together, you get nearly 25% of students in England are not regularly attending traditional physical school. Nearly 25% of school-age children. It is quite extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah. So not only do we have a real challenge with teacher recruitment, we also have a real challenge with student engagement in traditional physical school. And I think we need to, and we want to, face up to these brutal facts. And then I also think we can start to think of, and what we are starting to think of, are what are alternative solutions. You know, can we do things differently and do them better? So we can dig into this teacher recruitment issue, and we can really dig into this student attendance and engagement problem. And if we don't start doing things differently, is anything really going to change? So we've talked quite a lot about online schooling. So obviously we've got physical schools. We've had those for a long time now. We've got homeschooling. And actually, we've had homeschooling for a long time. Homeschooling was probably the first type of schooling, the one-room schoolhouse.
Yeah, Henry VIII was homeschooled.
Well, there we go. Yeah, so we've got homeschooling, we've got physical schools, we've got online schooling, and online schooling is really a thing. And we're both interested in this territory. And what I was interested to find out, one of the things I learned from the COBIS Conference, is that there are, in the Good Schools Guide, there are 12 online schools listed, and there are many more that are up for review. So already in the Good Schools Guide, we've got 12 online schools that have been identified as good schools. So online schools are definitely part of our educational landscape, and they are providing a need for perhaps a certain type of student. They might still be on the fringes, but they're definitely encroaching. But I guess what we want to try and move on to talk about today, Mark, is, so we've got our physical schools, we've got our home schools, we've got our online schools. There's a fourth type of school that's also emerging, and that's the hybrid school. What is a hybrid school, Mark, from your point of view, your definition?
Yeah, I think people are using the word hybrid in a lot of different ways, and so I'm going to use it as being the combination of bricks and mortar education. In other words, being in a physical school as we'd know it, being taught remotely, like we've talked a lot about remote teaching. So, and then sort of self-schooling, online learning, if you like, using an online learning platform. And that's sort of three parts, it might be a third, or it might be a different ratio. And I think that's where we get to this debate. But I think we've got this model is happening. And interestingly, it's growing from, we've got a convergence at the moment of this group, into this space. It's converging because we've got, on the one hand, we've got schools unable to find teachers for shortage subjects. So, for example, there's a pilot running in Essex where they're looking at teaching physics to 3 classes at the same time. The teacher isn't in any of the classrooms, but is in the school. And then you've got tutors, teaching assistants in each of the 3 classrooms supervising the classes who are taught remotely by the teacher. We've got independent schools are moving into the space of keeping their Latin A-level, Greek A-level, computer studies A-level, German A-level, subjects that are shortage subjects are being taken online and they're being remote, although it's a physical school. For some of those lessons, they're there. So you've got that end of remote where it's encroaching as well. And then the other interesting thing is that the online schools are finding that their communities want to meet physically. So I know Minerva, for example, have got clusters of their learners. So let's say, for example, you've got a cluster of learners in Manchester, and they might meet for a school trip into Manchester Art Gallery or something, and it enables the students and indeed their parents to meet and be part of a community. So we are community and community animals, aren't we? So we've got this, but I think in the long run, we're going to have schools will become hybrid, and I think there are a number of drivers behind that. I think, obviously we've got recruitment crisis, getting teachers. I think, flexible working and society saying we don't actually need to go into a space to study or work. So I think flexible working. I think there's cost. I mean, this is a much cheaper model to deliver. There'll be many more people wanting to be involved in it. And then reach, I think, globally. I think this will allow us to come up with models for schooling that allow us to educate a large proportion of people who currently can't afford education. And I think that's all underpinned by technology. So, I mean, none of this is possible without decent bandwidth and decent online learning platforms and all the rest of it. So that's why I think we're heading towards hybrid. And I think it's a very exciting journey. I don't know what you think. I mean, you've got a bit of experience in this. And, I think it's interesting how your remote teachers in Salalah actually physically spend some time in the school before teaching remotely. Do you want to, I think perhaps you should add a bit in about how you do that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I think we all were reminded in COVID how important the community dimension to schooling and education is, and how much we missed that community dimension when it wasn't there. And like you say, Mark, I think online teaching did that get a bad press, not so much because there was online teaching going on, is because actually the students weren't in school. So an online teaching doesn't need to mean that the students are not in school. And when we first shared the model with our parents down in Salalah, their key focus or key concern was that they didn't really mind what was going to happen in school, whether it was online or face-to-face, as long as their children were in school. But yes, so bearing in mind this community point, I mean, one of the things we've learned over the last 5 to 6 years is, like you say, that community dimension is really important. That face-to-face relationship is really important. So with the A-level psychology teachers that we've employed for next year for here in Muscat, we've made it very clear that they will spend a few days at the start of the school year with the year 12 students to get to know them, establish the relationship and expectations. They'll meet again in term 2 and again in term 3. And we've been building that into as many of our online arrangements as we possibly can, as we've been evolving the modern Salalah. And now we make that a very clear expectation when we're starting this program in Muscat. So I think that's really important. Just coming back to your factors that and how this is evolving, how the hybrid's evolving. I think maybe another area is where we've got state schools and independent schools who are trying to grapple with that really serious attendance and engagement issue that I referred to. Yeah, nearly 25% of students in the UK, or in England at least, not engaged regularly in a physical traditional school. And I have read quite a lot of examples where both independent schools and state schools are using online and using, maybe flexible attendance in the physical schools supported by online schooling to encourage students who are struggling to engage and attend, using that as a mechanism for trying to get students re-engaged and re-attending with school. So, yeah, that remote hybrid modality has got a number of problems which it can address. And it might not be perfect, but there are ways into some of these really challenging problems through hybrid, I think.
Yeah, and I think the attendance thing is a very interesting one because, I think one of the criticisms that people level at hybrid, or when we start talking about hybrid, is that they say, well, there is a childcare aspect to it. So And I totally agree. I think schools, just because some of the lessons are online, it doesn't mean that the students can't access those lessons from school. Or even if they're doing personalized learning, there's no reason why that can't be in school. I think whatever model we come up with, there has to be, the students have to have the option to be in school 5 days a week for that learning. But we might recognize that perhaps only 2.5 days of that might be face-to-face teaching. I think it's about, and this will lead to different designs of school that will need, online spaces and access to bandwidth and access to technology for this obviously to work. But I think we're going to see that. And I think, if you look at this in terms of, sort of the classic Clayton Christensen disruption theory, what happens, what Christensen says works, with disruption is that they starts at the margins and then becomes and moves to the mainstream. And, we can see this happening. Here you've got, we've got sort of hybrid and online teaching at the margins. It's elite sports people are looking for this sort of model so that they can do their sports training, young athletes. And we've got it with neurodiverse students who are school refusers. We've got it with students who are traveling, and their families are highly mobile. So we're gradually seeing more and more people. We're seeing it at the margins in terms of subjects, like, this is the way Latin might be continue to be delivered in schools, or indeed some of the modern languages. So I think, but what will happen over time, as you've done really at Salala, because I think you're really at the cutting edge of this. Psychology A levels are much more mainstream A level. I mean, it's the most popular subject at university in Britain at the moment. So psychology A level is a mainstream subject, and yet it's not like you're trying to keep your German going or Latin. This is a really mainstream subject, and you've offered it online. So I think that's a really good example of it moving from this remote teaching model moving towards the mainstream.
You started to get into design there of a hybrid school, and we've been doing some work, you, myself, and the team, Ben Marston's team at Jessica and Wiles, who are architects based in central London. And Ben started to unveil some of the sort of prototype designs that we've been putting together for what we call the hybrid academy. So let's maybe explore that a little bit further. If you were designing a hybrid school from scratch, if you had that opportunity, what might it look like?
Well, I think there's got to be, I suppose, three elements to it. I think it needs to have community spaces, so where people can come together and be a community, whether that's, so it needs the dining halls, and it needs social spaces, perhaps a cafe culture sort of type thing. It needs personal study spaces where students can engage in online learning and remote teaching. And it needs specialist spaces. We still, if we're going to teach, we teach a number of subjects in schools that need specialist facilities and don't translate well to remote teaching. And I'm thinking of design technology and art and some of the sort of creative subjects like that. Looking at science practicals, sports practicals, and these sorts of things. But I think one of the interesting observations that we came up with when we were doing this was that if you can teach it in a classroom, a standard box classroom, you can teach it remotely, as a general rule of thumb. That may need a different pedagogy, and we'll crack that one in due course. But I do think that if you were designing it, you wouldn't put many what we think of as traditional classrooms into the hybrid school, the hybrid academy, sort of thing. So I think it is specialist spaces, community spaces, and study spaces.
Okay, so you got those three elements, key elements. And for what sort of students, what age students would you be designing the hybrid academy for?
Well, I think when we were, I think we're all agreed that sixth formers can take this very easily. And I think the experience during COVID, certainly, during, running top international schools, I think our sixth formers cope very well, arguably better than they do normally. And some of our top students got even more done than they do because they didn't have the travel time. So I think sixth form will be fine on the whole. I think Key Stage 4 will be fine. And I think the hybrid academy, I think you'd have to build in a Key Stage 3, and there you might need standard classrooms if you're going to do it, because you've got to train them up. So at some point they've got, this is about upskilling the students as well. So students need to learn how to study remotely, how to do a remote lesson. So I think I would, given that the standard structure of a school, most places in the world is 11 to 18, Key Stage 3. I think you'd have to effectively really mix it up, and probably the balance between face-to-face and remote teaching and online for a Key Stage 3 would be significantly different mix. It might be something like 70, 15, 15, whereas for a sixth former, it might be 30, 30, 33, 33, 33. So, you'd look at it very different mix. So I think that's really how it will work. I think the structure itself is fairly sound.
Okay. So in terms of then attendance at the hybrid academy, so I think what I'm thinking, and see if you're on the same page, Jim, what I'm thinking is we would probably expect all the students to attend the community orientated learning. So sport, practical science, perhaps music, art, drama, design technology, where they're going to be doing practical work together. They're going to be attending everybody's going to be attending the hybrid academy for those practical community focused learning experiences. But then, like you say, for the learning which might take place in the normal traditional box classroom, that's where there would be an option that students could be doing that learning in school, but not necessarily in a classroom. They might have their own learning space for that. A bit like, I think many of us have heard of I think it's called Inter-High in California, where each student has their own learning area where they can access online learning in this way. But also some students, if their parents supported it, could be accessing that learning from home. So there'd be a common community learning program that everybody would attend the school for, but then the learning that didn't require those practical community spaces, that could happen either in school or at home, depending on the support of the family.
Yeah, and I think you could have very efficient use of resources, and by resources I mean spaces and specialist teachers. So there's real scope for a specialist physicist, for example, physics teacher, to teach 2 shifts during the week. So if you sort of said that face-to-face was roughly, 2 days of the week would be face-to-face, then there's scope for a teacher with 20% non-contact time to do 2 days with one group of students and doing, the physics practicals and so on. A different physics teacher teaching remotely the other bits of the week, so that the in-person, on-site physics teacher would teach could teach effectively 2 cohorts at the same time, but only teaching the practical aspects. So whereas a remote physics teacher would then pick up perhaps the more theoretical aspects, and they'd have to work in tandem, obviously.
Mm-hmm. And then, so I guess this hybrid academy becomes very much a community learning space, and as many schools do at the moment, you can then open up those community learning spaces for drama, for art, for music, for sport. You can open those up to the wider community. And if you design this in such a way that it's relatively easy to open up those spaces to the community when the students aren't using those spaces. And so maybe these schools are, like I say, they're smaller because they don't need all the classroom space, and they are the heart of the local community.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, the model that we're sort of exploring, isn't it? Is, you have a sort of pod, a sort of network model where you have these pods of schools that, that you have a hybrid pod, and you'd have one in each community. And I mean, I genuinely think this will be the model for the state sector in the UK in 10, 15 years time, because, probably using current facilities, but in a very different way. Because I think that the teacher, demand for teachers and the shortage of specialist teachers will force, and we can see this in Essex already, different models to be explored. But I think schools have always been special, hubs. I mean, those of us that run international schools know that your school is far more important than just being a place of learning. It's a very important part for parents as well, that they are part of the community, and it being part of that. So I do think this model has got real traction in the long run. And it's I worry that the sort of classic, we have this what I call a business class mentality. We've been flying business all of our lives, and we're used to this idea of sort of a teacher in front of 20, 30 students, and that teacher has got a relevant degree and a relevant teacher training qualification. There are other ways of flying than flying business class, and I know that, to some extent, what I'm proposing is the equivalent, is the educational equivalent of Ryanair. But if we are going to educate the world, then perhaps we need to look at slightly different models.
Yeah, and I might start to challenge that analogy. I think it is a good analogy in terms of, but I guess if we start to look at the advantages of a hybrid model, I think we're actually talking about a completely different type of aircraft. And we're talking about a type of aircraft where there's more flexibility for students. So students can balance academic work, the commitments. So there's more flexibility for students because they don't have to be there all the time. And there's more flexibility for staff. So, and obviously that's the issue around, teacher recruitment. I think we think one of the key issues there is flexibility, and a hybrid school enables you to employ staff much more flexibly. So that's I'd say a better model. And then in terms of support for vulnerable learners, and this whole attendance engagement issue, students who have got anxiety or attendance issues, the hybrid model gives a lot more flexibility and maybe personalization in how you can support those students, because you're not saying you have to be at school, Monday to Friday, and if you're not at school, you say, well, you can be at school on Monday, but then you might need some support in this space on Tuesday, and you might be at home on a Wednesday, and so you can meet the needs of a much more diverse student population, I think, more effectively with a hybrid model. So I'm not sure what the aeroplane version of this is, but if it's more flexible and personalized, it might be, I guess, in my dream that everybody can fly a version of business class, but it actually doesn't cost the same as business class. It's like the dream, really.
We're going to end up being an airplane if we're not careful. So, I do take your point. I mean, if we're happy with, students doing German A-level online because we can't really afford a German teacher anymore, then it does open up the possibility of offering Italian A-level or Russian A-level or Mandarin A-level or whatever in addition, that we've never actually had on the curriculum. So rather than this being something that is cutting stuff down and driving cost down, we could actually see this as an opportunity to expand a curriculum and offer 7 or 8 languages at A-level, for example, or to offer classical civilization and ancient history or whatever, so we could end up with much more refined models, because we're going to look at different ways of staffing it remotely. And I think these things, I mean, realistically, I think these will really get traction in an international context, because if you look at the cost of an international teacher, I mean, you're paying obviously a great salary, but you're also paying for accommodation. You're obviously, doing visas for family, medical for family, flights for family. I mean, the add-on costs on an international teacher coming into a school can almost double the salary. And so the alternative being a remote teacher makes that much, much more cost effective. And I think, we will have to do a bit of work around time zones. I mean, certainly our experience in Kellett during COVID, when I let people teach outside country, was that it was much more effective plus or minus 2 hours. I think that, when we had teachers back in the UK trying to teach remotely into Hong Kong in the middle of the night, it wasn't so effective. They weren't able to be as available as the teachers who were in Thailand, for example.
I'm thinking back now to probably the late 90s when we started to get, I think quite a lot of people started to get quite excited about the potential for technology to transform education. And I think we're still waiting, aren't we? We're still waiting for that to happen. But there was a lot of talk about anytime, anywhere learning. And I think we have, and I think what COVID showed us as well was COVID showed us that the technology now exists where you can learn anytime, anywhere.
And it was Martini learning, wasn't it? Any time, any place, anywhere. I remember having managing to download the theme tune and using it for one. But yeah, this idea of Martini learning, these sort of, which to some extent we've got. I mean, that was really around connectivity, universal connectivity. But
and I guess
you're absolutely right. It is, Martini learning is got to come back.
So the fact that technology has got to the point now where that now is possible. And I guess the changes in society that we've had since COVID around flexible working, and that's becoming, it's still contentious, but I think it seems to be, it's going to be part of global civilization ahead for a while. You put those two things together, the technology and the flexibility. What we're trying to do is, well, how do you reimagine schooling when you've got a different world of technology that does allow anytime, anywhere, any place learning, and you've got a society that in large part does accept that you don't always have to be in a building to work, to learn, to study, and so on. So I think it's really exciting. By the showing of the attendance at our session at COBIS, I mean, there were people who have been turned away, and they had to cut us off, which upset a few people. So, yeah, it's a really fascinating discussion. And there are also lots of things happening out there, which we want to try and bring all these, or as many of these different bits and pieces together into one space. So we've had the idea of actually having an event in London on the 20th of January, on the Tuesday, just before the BET show starts on the Wednesday. So 20th of January, 2026. We are going to confirm the location very shortly. We will share, certainly on LinkedIn and through other social media, how this is going to take place. But if you would like to join us to discuss going remote, hybrid, this emerging world of education that is starting to shape the future, if you'd like to join us, please contact Mark or myself, because I think we both think this is a really exciting time for the redesign and reimagining of schooling. Would you agree?
Oh, totally. I think it's going to be a great debate. And I should just add a bit of a coda that if you're not in your 50s and can't remember Martini adverts from the late 70s, early 80s, I suggest you Google it, because I'm very conscious there's a whole group of listeners who probably have no concept of what Martini learning might look like unless you knew those adverts.
Okay. So there's a theme there which we might have to develop. Okay, so we're going to leave it there for now. But I say, if you would like to get involved in this event on the 20th of January, then we'd love to hear from you. And as always, connect with us, engage with us on LinkedIn and other platforms. And we really look forward to developing not only the conversation, but these models of education, which are going to be an increasingly part of the future of education. Okay, Mark, thanks for joining us today. It's always great to talk to you.
It's always great. I think, we've both been involved in educational technology for a very long time now. And I think it is great. It has promised a lot and under-delivered so far, but I think we're getting there. I do think we're getting there. This is very exciting stuff. And I'm very excited for the conference on the 20th of January. I think it would be great to really have time to have that conversation in depth throughout the day. And I think we're looking at the whole range of issues, including the sort of some of the sort of really, more technical bits like, how you do HR for remote teaching and, safeguarding and those sorts of things, as well as a very big discussion around pedagogy and what schools of the future might look like. So a really open discussion. I think there'll be breakouts and there'll be panels and main stage, but it should be great fun. And we look forward to being involved in that.
And I think Ben Marston from Logistico and Wiles will be very eager to reveal a lot more of the design concepts that him and his team have been shaping up over the last few months for this hybrid academy, because they've actually gone into quite a lot of detail about what this might look like. And I think that's also going to be a really exciting provocation.
Absolutely.
Okay, so thanks, Mark. Enjoy half term, which I think is coming up to you soon. And I'll see you soon. Take care.
Take care. Thanks a lot, Guy.
You've been listening to the Educator's Corner podcast, the show that brings you conversations with educators from all over the world, the podcast where we stay curious for just a little bit longer. The Educator's Corner podcast is hosted by me, Kai Vasher, and produced by Stuart Pardoe, Zoe Snell, and Marion James, and by BSM BSS Productions.